Hello and welcome to Lame Stream, a weekly show that aims to guide you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, how you going?
I'm going really well, man. It's very nice weather up here, which I know it's not in Melbourne. How are you doing down there?
I'm good. I recently moved house. If people watching these videos see a different background,
I'm very excited for you.
Sound is slightly less conditioned. I'm still in the process of figuring out the sound in this room, but Bez, our wonderful producer, will do an excellent job to fix it. Hey, Scott, got to talk to you about something.
Please.
I saw what I think is the best journalism movie since Spotlight this week.
Bold. Yeah, what?
It's a little movie called Superman.
I've heard journalism features a little. I mean, obviously Clark Kent, but I've heard that it features it a little more than you'd expect.
Well, yeah, so Clark Kent, who is Superman's alter ego, for people who don't know, is a journalist. He works at a fictional newspaper called The Daily Planet. His girlfriend, Lois Lane, is a journalist there as well, and one of his best friends, Jimmy Olsen, is a photographer. So journalism and newspapers have been a big part of Superman, since day one. But I was really fascinated at how much journalism was in this big, shiny action blockbuster. There are so many journalism characters. There are so many scenes of an editor demanding stories. There are detailed scenes of journalists writing stories inside a CMS, which is how journalists write and file stories. I would argue the climax of the movie is perhaps a journalist character writing a story and then ticking the web ready and print ready options.
Oh my God.
Their CMS. And there are also some ethical journalistic conundrums that arise. I don't want to get into too many details, but I did want to talk about it briefly because we are a podcast that covers journalism and the media. I mean, you've got Superman's alter ego Clark Kent, who is interviewing himself, and he's getting all these scoops because he's interviewing Superman. That I would argue suggests a ethical dilemma for the journalist. Then to try to rectify that ethical dilemma, he decides to be interviewed by his girlfriend, Lois Lane. I would argue that sort of compounds the ethical dilemma here.
Yeah.
And then you have Jimmy Olsen, his friend, who's getting a big scoop that, impacts the plot of the film significantly by reaching out to an ex-lover of his and promising to spend the weekend with her if she decides to give him important information, which I guess at the very least flips that old trope that a lot of films have where it's the woman journalist who sleeps with a source to get a story. Anyway, I just got to say, I enjoyed the movie. There's a lot going for this film, but I was happily surprised at the amount of journalism that it featured as well.
Well, I got to say, I mean, this is the first time I've heard about Clark Kent venturing into a CMS, which I'm so excited about because that is honestly one of the most heroic things that journalists have to do on a daily basis. CMSs are treacherous places. They're full of danger. Many a story has been accidentally deleted or accidentally published when it wasn't ready. And that sounds very brave of Clark to venture in there.
I can't reiterate enough how much of this movie's plot and its climax revolves around the act of journalism and the act of using a CMS. So if you listen to this podcast, you care about journalism, I recommend giving Superman a spin.
It sounds a little, what I'm also happy about, Oz, it sounds a little bit more realistic. Like comic books have featured a lot of journalists, I feel like, like Peter Parker's a photographer, Spider-Man, there's a bunch. And it always feels like in the old adaptations that we grew up on, it's a very quaint view of journalism. It's sort of like,
yes,
get me those pictures, Peter Parker. And I feel like whenever Bruce Wayne arrives at a thing, there's a female journalist who's like, sorry, Mr. Wayne, I'm actually a journalist. Can I ask you for your thoughts on Gotham? That's a question that they would ask. What are your thoughts on the city? It's for a front page. What?
I think this movie grapples with both mainstream journalism, but let me tell you, there's quite a bit going on in terms of the world of social media, and the way that impacts audiences' understanding of the news. I mean, the whole kind of plot of this revolves around Superman being cancelled by his arch-villain, Lex Luthor, and social media plays a big role in that. But it is interesting how these movies, we don't have to keep talking about it, but I have noticed that modern media is kind of creeping in to cinema more and more. Journalists have often been useful protagonists for movies. My theory, I don't know if you've got thoughts on this, is like a journalist, kind of like a detective, is a very helpful character for any movie because by the nature of their job, they're seeking to find out information. And by doing so, the audience gets that information.
Yeah, it pushes a plot forward. It helps uncover things. I mean, I hope that, you know, if it's a decent representation, I mean, like my dad became a journalist in part because he was buying Superman comics from a news agent in Townsville and was just reading Superman comics.
That's awesome.
And like wanted to be a journalist.
That's great lore.
Hopefully if this is like a cool depiction, some good people become journalists. Who knows?
Well, that did make me start thinking about like the modern representation of journalism in a lot of movies. I've noticed that podcasters, Scott, are frequently popping up in pop culture. In a lot of movies recently, Godzilla vs. Kong, Ghostbusters Afterlife, the romantic queer comedy Bros that came out a couple of years ago. All the main characters in that are podcasters. Twisters, the reboot, is about YouTubers.
That other show with Kristen Bell and Seth Cohen, not Seth Cohen, Adam Brody. Seth Cohen's the character. But like that's all about podcasters as well. Like I don't know how.
And just like that, the Sex and the City reboot, podcasters. Yeah, I guess that's good for us. Is that good?
More romantic comedy in my life as an actual podcaster. That would
be good. All right, good to know that there is a big screen adaptation of Lamestream probably heading your way at some point soon. But today on the show, let's get into it. What are we talking about? We're talking about what is going on in federal politics. We started this podcast just a week before the last federal election. And since then, the months since that election, Parliament is yet to sit. The government has done very little on the policymaking and legislative front, aside from, of course, open up a huge new gas field for exploration and mining and preside over the slow decay of basically every other public institution. The coalition seems to be in disarray. The Greens and the Teals are kind of AWOL. It does feel odd that with everything going on in the country and in the world, there doesn't seem to be much discussion about what is going on in federal politics. So we decided to take a closer look at the big issues and how they are or they're not being covered. But one thing that was happening, Scott, this week in the world of politics was the release of a review into anti-Semitism by the government-appointed special envoy into combating anti-Semitism. The review was launched by the envoy, Gillian Siegel, alongside Anthony Albanese and the Home Affairs Minister, Tony Burke. It has come under significant criticism for some of its recommendations, which include giving the envoy sweeping powers to regulate the media, potentially stripping arts institutions and universities of funding, and perhaps most controversially, embedding a definition of anti-Semitism into all layers of government and public institutions that would prohibit criticism of Israel. We will dig into those recommendations and the reaction to that review, as well as revelations that Gillian Siegel's husband was a significant donor to the far-right campaign group Advance. And later in the episode, a preview of the Tasmanian election being held this weekend and the role the AFL is playing in the Apple Islands politics, as well as a look at why the ABC, our beloved ABC, is addicted to turning everything into a Gruen-style comedy panel show.
Oh, who doesn't need another one? Make sure everyone to head over to lamestream.com.au. There were two great exclusive stories that we're kind of going to mention in some of these chats because they relate to some of the things we're talking about, but two great exclusive stories last week, and you can sign up and subscribe to the newsletter. Not only does it mean that you get those exclusives, but it is the best way to support our work and help us be able to keep bringing you this podcast every week. So become a subscriber, head to lamestream.com.au. But Oz, let's kick things off, shall we?
Scott, speaking of our newsletter, I wanted to start with a story about a story that I wrote last week, because it was actually my first brush with the anti-Semitism review that has since become, I think it's fair to say, probably the biggest story of the past week.
Yeah, it was a pretty busy Thursday for us. We had a whole other article lined up. You got this tip about more on Sabsabi, and talking on the phone to you, we basically realized talking about this story that the anti-Semitism review was about to drop, which had huge ramifications on the story. So tell us a little bit about what you found and how it kind of links in.
So I've been reporting on the reinstatement of Khaled Sabsabi as the artist representing Australia to the 2026 Venice Biennale for the last couple of weeks. And in that reporting, I mentioned a highly defamatory dossier that had been doing the rounds in the arts community and in the media world aimed at stopping Sabsabi from becoming the Australian representative. Last week, I got a tip that there was a second, much more detailed dossier that was doing the rounds, that was basically going through 16 of Khaled's artworks and claiming that he was a supporter of Islamic fundamentalism, of extremism, of terrorism, and that his work demonstrated that he was an anti-Semite, someone who had hatred of Jews, and his work was making Jewish people feel unsafe. So I was kind of digging into that and looking at the details of that dossier, where it could have come from, where it was going. And I ascertained that the dossier had been sent amongst art world figures, but it had also been sent to journalists at News Corp who were planning a story about it for the following weekend. Kind of decided that this is something we should probably work on. And then on Thursday morning, as you mentioned, Scott, we saw this announcement that the anti-Semitism review was dropping. Quickly read it, watched the press conference. And one thing that stood out to me, because the Sabsabi stuff was in my head, was the section on arts and cultural institutions. Basically, the recommendation from the envoy here was that if arts institutions or cultural spaces or festivals support artists or engage in processes that contribute to their definition of anti-Semitism and support anti-Semitism, they should be stripped of funding. Now, I thought that was really interesting that review was dropping on Thursday morning. This dossier alleging that Khaled Sabsabi was an anti-Semite was circulating in the weeks leading up, and the stories planned to come out as a result of it were about to drop on the Friday and the Saturday. And so you and I had this conversation. We thought these things seem kind of linked. It seems like someone is hoping that the anti-Semitism review will specifically talk about anti-Semitism in the arts, and that by painting Khaled Sabsabi as an anti-Semite, they will have the ammunition they need to argue for him to be dropped. And in fact, Scott, that's exactly what happened. When the News Corp article in the Daily Telegraph landed that following weekend, it referenced the anti-Semitism review explicitly, and it leveled accusations against Sabsabi as well as another arts figure for statements that they had made critical of Israel, alleging that these people were anti-Semitic and therefore they should be stripped of funding and support because of what the envoy had outlined in the review. So that was kind of our first tangling of this in terms of the way that Lamstrom was reporting it. But it turned out that there would be ramifications from this review that went way beyond just Sabsabi and just the art. So let's rewind for a second and talk about the review and the envoy. Who is Gillian Siegel, and where did this review come from?
Yeah, so Siegel has a legal background, but really for the last few years, she's served on heaps of different boards across Australia. And she's the immediate prior president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, which is the largest, really, of the Jewish community lobby groups that identifies itself as pro-Israel. She was appointed in July last year by the Albanese government and basically tasked with developing this plan to combat anti-Semitism, and we now finally have it a year later. So it may not come as a surprise that in this plan we now have, it is almost identical to a list of recommendations developed by her former body, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, which was announced at a summit that was held by Sky News. In terms of digging into those announcements, Oz, and explaining them for people, something I was baffled by the early reporting on this and how a lot of places covered it was that no one seemed to talk about Siegel's motivation in pursuing this plan in this way. Still today, I could find no reference to this on the ABC or the SMH or Age coverage. But in the document, she specifically says this in large part is about altering the views of younger people in Australia. She says in the report that there's a stark divide between Australians who are under 35 and over 35, and that there's generational differences in media consumption, and that's kind of affected younger Australians and their perception of the Middle East and the Jewish community. But crucially, she says, these differences in attitude to Jewish Australians and to the existence of the State of Israel, and that divide has informed many elements in this plan. Now, Oz, I didn't have to kind of go digging deep and being some like great investigative journalist to find that. It's a pretty short document. It's on page 4. And it just seemed strange to me that the media reported on this announcement without talking about the thing that, quote, has informed many elements of this plan, the motivation, and I reckon that that's because a lot of journalists see that the anti-Semitism envoy is saying that part of her motivation behind the whole plan is to convince under 35s to change their opinions on the existence of the state of Israel. And they know that quoting that bit will make this appear on its surface so bizarre, if that's the cause of it. Their readers will look at that and think that's very odd. So they just kind of skim over it. In their head, it's like, this is a very simple story. Last week, there were these horrific attacks on the Jewish community. That's how we've covered it. Here's a proposed solution. That's my story. Shout out to The Guardian's Ariel Bogle and Josh Butler for being maybe the only ones to include this in kind of day one reporting on the plan.
Yeah, good pick up on that. I mean, I think it's interesting that they cite this research in this report, but they don't actually provide us the data, so we don't know. But it is kind of giving the game away there a little bit, isn't it? It's like people over 35 who consume mainstream media, where most of the editors and senior journalists have been on junkets to Israel and have a structural bias in favor of Israel, they think everything's fine. Younger people who eschew legacy media and are just watching the reality of this war on the ground seem to be quite critical of Israel. They're literally saying this is a political response to a political divide over what Israel is doing. You're totally right that this should have been a much bigger, focus of the entire conversation in the past week.
Yeah, it sort of seems like the media is treating it like, matter of controversy. Is the plan actually about criticism of Israel or is it not? When you say that part of the motivation is influencing under 35s and their opinion on the existence of the state of Israel, I think black and white, it is about opinions on the state of Israel. Now, Oz, what is her proposal, I suppose? The report lays out a plan to kind of restrict or withdraw funding from particular cultural or education sectors, in particular, both organizations and individuals, and toughen the way that organizations deal with complaints when it comes to allegations of anti-Semitism or those organizations being involved in anti-Semitic tropes and ideas. But the thing that sits over this whole plan is the recommendation that all levels, as you mentioned, of federal policymaking adopt this very specific definition of what anti-Semitism is, the IHRA definition. Now, some people listening will have already heard that definition is controversial, Oz. The controversial element is that it does include some criticisms of Israel as part of the definition, and there have been some explainers floating around progressive outlets that have tried to explain why that's so controversial. But what I haven't seen many people dive into is how Siegel herself responds to questions about why criticisms of Israel should be in the definition. And I think her answer helps explain why the media really failed to interrogate this fully.
Some people say, as you said, that the Jewish Council say, maybe it stops criticism of Israel. And that is a complete misunderstanding of the definition. The definition in its own terms clearly says, if Israel is criticized like any other country, that's absolutely fine. And indeed, so many Israelis are criticizing the policies of their own government. But if you are calling for the elimination of the state of Israel, then that is anti-Semitic. And that is all that the definition says in terms of...
Now, Oz, you hear that. I think that basically journalists who are very time poor go, oh, well, that sounds reasonable enough. She's explained it. It's only people who are who want to wipe Israel off the face of the map. That sounds pretty bad. And it makes their story, again, simpler. It's just, despite controversial definition, anti-Semitism plan rolls on. But I want to hit pause there because the way Siegel's characterizing it makes it sound sort of slightly extreme in some way, the speech she's talking about. The IHRA includes itself the example that saying that the state of Israel is a racist endeavor would be anti-Semitic. Now, by my reading, that calling the State of Israel a sort of racist enterprise, these are ideas that are put forward by people like Edward Said, Hanan Ashrawi, like very respectable, mainstream, kind of anti-colonial Palestinian scholars, big parts of like this debate that have been part of this debate for decades. And the idea that those thoughts would be considered anti-Semitic and that the citing of those by artists, by public broadcasters, festivals, and the idea that funding could be cut for the citing of those ideas, I mean, it is essentially to me a blacklisting of those ideas and people who are influenced by them from kind of public life.
Yeah, and let's be very specific about a sentence that would fall under this definition and would lead to the blacklisting. The argument that Israel is an apartheid state, which is something that various human rights bodies have found. That is a statement that the state of Israel, as it operates under a racist manner, where it's separate rights for separate people based on their ethnic background. The idea that should be blacklisted by all layers of the Australian government and independent cultural bodies or media institutions should be stripped of funding, or people should be punished for expressing that view is quite extraordinary. I think we talked about this when we were talking about Zoran Mamdani, the New York City Democratic candidate for mayor, and he's been presented with these questions. Do you think Israel should exist as a Jewish state, right? Which seems as a benign framing of a question, but what that question implies is, do you think Israel should exist as a racist apartheid state where Jews are given more rights than Palestinians? And his response is, I believe that Israel should exist as a state with equal rights for all people. So he is critiquing the racist nature of the state of Israel. He would be deemed an anti-Semite under these rules. I think it's important for people to understand the exact consequences of agreeing to that kind of definition. This is interesting to watch the reaction, Scott, to this play out, both the immediate reaction and what happened in the days since, because I think it was quite revealing. The government launched the review. Albanese was there and he sort of welcomed the review, but he very interestingly didn't commit to all of its recommendations. He said he would implement some things immediately, but he wouldn't respond on others till later. We don't know exactly what he is and isn't supporting yet, but it did suggest there was some wariness within Labor ranks that perhaps some of this stuff was going a bit too far. The coalition, of course, attacked him for not immediately implementing every single thing that Siegel had outlined, so we know what their position is on this. The response from the rest of the community was also interesting. The kind of line was, we welcome the review, but we will sit and think about the recommendations. That was the response from the university sector, who were a part of the review, and there were recommendations that Siegel herself would do a kind of report card into university anti-Semitism. The media reaction was interesting. News Corp and the 9 papers, at least initially, were pretty effusive in terms of kind of taking the line, this is a big landmark review, it's identified serious problems. They were putting those stories up at the top of the website. They were finding people to interview. They were looking at how it would play out in the university sector and the media sector. There was pretty, supportive coverage from those outlets. There was some reporting about the controversial nature of the IHRA definition in those papers too. It's worth mentioning. But the general sense I got, Scott, was that everyone, even some of the people who are maybe politically aligned to Siegel and agree with her view on Israel, thought that the review actually had gone a bit too far and was kind of bonkers, but they were all waiting for someone else to say it. No one wanted to be the first person to say, hey, this person is kind of crazy and this review has gone way too far. They felt that, but they were very muted in how they were articulating it. That was the sense that I had.
Yeah, and I think you can see that with now at this point, as we're talking, there have been some more articles from like legal experts and things appearing in those publications. But the first few days, there was very little interrogation of these issues. And I think part of the reason was that the first wave of criticism was very muted, even from kind of progressives that you would expect to take this plan to task. Like I saw the Greens' David Shoebridge told The Guardian that space had to be allowed for criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza, which felt to me like he was just saying, I don't have any thoughts about this plan. Just everyone remember, I'm against what Israel's doing in Gaza. Like I have no idea, but remember, we're good on Gaza. And then The MEAA, which is the Union for Journalists and Arts Workers who are very affected under this plan, kind of called for a careful consideration of free speech issues as the Albanese government weighs this up. So both kind of sections the media would kind of depend on, I think, for some space to talk about criticism, seemed in that first day to be slightly muted. And I think it shows how spooked everyone is by accusations of anti-Semitism, that it really took Jewish Australians to kind of break the dam and get serious critique into mainstream media. Obviously, there were other people doing a lot of work, but to get it into like mainstream pages, it kind of took Jewish Australians to talk about this.
Yeah, and I know that you've got some examples of that, but just before that, I think like it's interesting to just sit on why everyone felt so scared. And it's not without rationality, right? Like we have seen a campaign to demonize, criticize, fire, sanction people who criticize anything. You know, the kind of pro-Israeli lobby says this is not even a crazy thing to say, the reasonable response, kind of what I was expecting from the Greens and even from the MEAA was like, this is a bad faith review done to conflate genuine concerns around anti-Semitism with protection of the state of Israel. Its foundation is kind of broken and its recommendations are unhinged and insane and have way too much in common with a Sky News anti-Semitism conference. Like that's obviously what's going on here. And the fact that like the Greens and the media union had to really temper it, I thought was revealing in a way. But yeah, you were going to say that it took, figures in the Jewish community who obviously are a little bit more comfortable just throwing it out there to kind of break the dam on this.
Exactly, because they can't really be accused of that, or at least credibly accused of it. Yeah, like obviously other people were voicing this critique earlier, but I think in particular, Louise Adler, who's kind of longtime book publisher and festival director, was one of the first people to really do this in a mainstream publication in a very strong opinion piece in The Guardian. She said in that as a lobbyist immediately before this role, Siegel should have been completely disqualified. She points out the report equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and how dangerous that is, accuses the whole plan of overreach and seeking to, quote, prescribe who speaks and which views are deemed acceptable. And
strong stuff.
Really, that was the first place I saw really anyone in a mainstream forum take it to task. And that, I think, has kind of opened the door a bit. I wanted to play this grab from after that dam had burst a bit. And this is the lead drafter of the definition Siegel wants to use. He was on RN Breakfast on Monday, Kenneth Stern. And he's the lead drafter, but now thinks this definition is doing a lot of damage.
Is a particular type of hatred that leads to, problems that are, in my country at least, the United States, reminiscent of McCarthyism, the idea that you can lose your funding, which we're seeing, that you can be deported because you have an idea of something that's against an official definition. We wouldn't do that about racism. We wouldn't do it about anti-Palestinian animus. We wouldn't do it about other things. But it's being used this way, to go after speech. And what that does is not only harm democracy, it blinds us to how anti-Semitism actually works. I mean, if you think
this is, for example, someone who says they are a Zionist, who says they're not comfortable with all pro-Palestinian speech, and he is saying that this is McCarthyist thought policing, and it would even define Jews who are not Zionists as anti-Semites, which he, says is ridiculous. Like, to me, it is stunning that, the person who drafted this, whose whole career has been dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism, says this is McCarthyist thought policing, and that, I don't know, still only leaves us with kind of media coverage that is like, controversial definition, will we, won't they?
Yeah.
Like, what are we going to do? Rather than, this is like a crazy plan. Yeah, I mean, if this was any other issue in Australia, if the drafter of a definition being used said it would lead the Australian government to McCarthyist thought policing in the arts, education, and the media, people would be up in arms.
Yeah, it makes me feel less crazy considering I've been sort of, covering what I've described as the McCarthyism in the arts and in the media, since October 2023. Having this guy spell it out validating. Thanks for waking up, brother. But I think one thing that I was naive to was that this is a statement or a definition that Scott Morrison signed Australia up to in 2021, I think, and that the Labor government, when they've been questioned about it, have re-endorsed, right? They clearly don't want to pick a fight with Siegel and the Executive Council of Australian Jury on this. They kind of refuse to really explain what examples would cross the line, which I think is actually really dangerous. Like, I understand Labor's trying to walk both sides, and this is they are on fucking everything, but if they are launching a review and they have an envoy who advocates this definition and they've signed up to this definition and they are part of a government that is funding, whether it's arts institutions or the ABC, where these issues are occurring again and again, they kind of have to be very specific. If they're saying we are creating a new kind of social offense of criticism of the state of Israel, and if you express that, you could lose funding or be fired or be sanctioned, they have to actually explain what that means. I just don't think it's tenable to just... It's fine if it's hypothetical, but now that there are mechanisms being set up to sanction people with government backing, it's reached a pretty dark point that the government, I don't think, should be able to sidestep from.
Oh, I think it's dead right that they are not being pressed on examples enough. We spoke about how Siegel has kind of used the most extreme definition of what kind of criticism of Israel would be as like her example, like, oh, it would only apply to that kind of thing. The idea that Albanese or the Labor Party could put forward that, oh, no, even though the definition includes kind of things like talking about Israel as an apartheid state and all kinds of other things, oh, no, it would never be used for that. Once this definition is enshrined, it will be used. I mean, you're reporting on Sabsabi. I mean, the fact that he uses the letter 3 to represent a similar looking Arabic letter is being used to try and end his career. Like completely spurious things. You don't think that if a definition is put into all layers of funding and policy, it won't be used to the fullest extent of what that definition allows? It's bizarre that they think they can't talk about real world examples.
And on that, I mean, it's already being used by News Corp to batter people, even though it's not been adopted. Like, this review's not been adopted, and it's already being used. It's given, the worst actors in this basis from which to, like, try to ruin people's lives in this McCarthyist campaign. And Scott, there were revelations that kind of added another layer to this story. They were about Gillian Siegel's husband being a significant financial supporter of Advance, the far-right activist group that campaigned heavily against Labor and the Greens the last federal election. It's criticized Palestinian activists. It's a pretty hardline, pretty, anti-racism vehicle. Interestingly, the details about this donation were first reported by The Guardian in February. They reported that Henroth Investments, which is a family trust run by Siegel's husband and his brother, donated $50,000 to Advance in 2023 and 2024. Fascinatingly, that wasn't like the lead of that story. It was kind of buried pretty halfway through, even though it mentioned that Siegel was the anti-Semitism envoy. It was actually Anthony Klan, an independent journalist who runs a site called The Klaxon, who followed that up and basically republicized it with some extra information last week, and it went ballistic on social media, which is an interesting example of how, an independent journalist can take a bit of information and recontextualize it. And then it was followed up again by most other media outlets and got a lot of attention. The fact that Siegel's husband was a donor to a very hate-filled organization doing terrible things that seemed to be contrary to what the envoy is trying to do in terms of an anti-Semitism, anti-racism review. Now, Siegel has denied knowledge of that donation. There's no suggestion that her husband is involved in drafting the review, but it certainly got a lot of attention, and I thought her response was odd. I think Siegel used feminist language, and that was picked up by the Labor government when they were asked about it as well. This idea that, no one would support or defend my husband meddling in my affairs, so why would I meddle in his affairs? Trying to say, like, we have a separation of church and state here. I don't know how compelling that line of defense is, because, one thing, no one is suggesting that Siegel herself has donated. I think that's very important, and no one is suggesting her husband had any influence on this review, but The Guardian asked Siegel a bunch of follow-up questions. Do you support the work of Advance? Do you have any criticisms of the work of Advance? How do you think the work that Advance does intersects with your stated goal of trying to stop racism in Australia and stop anti-Semitism in Australia? She didn't respond. And I don't really think that's tenable. I think if you're a publicly funded government-appointed figure and this has come out, you kind of have to, at the very least, respond to those questions. You can't just bury your head in the sand. And I think it makes Labor look a bit stupid for appointing her when, her husband's family trust spent so much money trying to stop the government from winning the election.
Yeah. And I would say the other thing that doesn't quite, pass the kind of common sense test is, even if there's absolutely no knowledge or there's no, they are two individuals who pursue their careers, et cetera, it's like she herself is the former president of a very powerful lobby group. She understands how the world of lobbying works, the way of influence, the way that these organizations kind of conduct campaigns through the media or whatever. The idea that she is completely oblivious to what that means, what Advance does, their work, whether she endorses that or not. The idea that she doesn't have an opinion on it is kind of ridiculous, given that she herself has been a very powerful lobbyist in this country.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the question now is what happens here? I sort of see this going in one of two ways, and I'm not entirely sure what happens, because on one hand, I mean, there has now been a pretty significant reaction against this review from, all sorts of quarters. I think you mentioned, Louise Adler has come out criticizing it. Josh Bornstein wrote a piece in the Nine papers criticizing it as well. There don't seem to be too many champions of this outside the pro-Israel lobby. It's possible that the overstep, the fact that they went so far in this review, demanding so many powers and demanding, so many things be stripped of funding if you criticize Israel, that the whole thing just quietly just dies. The other option here is that, Labor doesn't agree with all the recommendations, but it finds compromises, and it does end up passing, laws that restrict how universities operate, how arts institutions operate. Perhaps Siegel is given powers to monitor the media. Unfortunately, I think that is probably closer to what we get than the report just dying, only because of past practice. But we have seen state and federal governments pass laws in response to lobbying and in response to, the efforts of pro-Israel groups. Do you have any thoughts as to what happens next?
Look, I don't know, but I don't have a huge amount of faith that kind of common sense and wisdom is going to prevail here. To me, it seems like the Albanese government thinks that everyone plays politics the way that the Labor Party does, which is concession. And they went, we'll give the Israel lobby this thing, appoint them to they'll kind of throw us a few recommendations. We'll do a few of them. It'll all be sweet. And it's you give them that and they will then ask for the strongest possible recommendations they can.
And accuse you of anti-Semitism if you don't implement them. Probably.
Exactly. And so now they're stuck where they can't be seen to not implement a review that they commissioned, that they had all the power over, into a pretty highly sensitive topic. And then at every press conference, whenever anything happens, they will be asked, why didn't you implement your own review? So I worry that they have trapped themselves because they assume that everyone plays politics like they do.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. All right. After the break, we're going to take a look at what is going on in Canberra and in the world of federal politics. All right, Scott, I want to put a bit of a theory to you, and the theory is about why I think there has been such little substantive discussion in the media about big political issues, the big issues facing the country, if you're allowed.
I love an Osman Faruqi theory. Let's go.
I guess the basis for this theory is that the country and the world are facing enormous challenges on a bunch of fronts, but when you open our newspapers...
This isn't about how weather doesn't exist, is it?
No. But yeah, when you read the news, when you watch the news, when you listen to the news, it doesn't really feel like we're grappling with the big policy questions, right? And this is the theory, right? Labor's in government. They're doing their thing. the coalition is kind of nowhere. Like Susan Lee is doing these puff pieces in Australian Women's Weekly to try to stamp her authority on the party and convince people that she's a real person to be taken seriously. But the party is clearly in an entirely strategic, tactical dead end. They have no idea what they're doing. They're kind of completely absent from any real conversations in politics. The Greens, it's sort of similar. I mean, they lost their leader. They lost a couple of lower house MPs. They are also licking their wounds, it seems, and not really taking much of a fight to the government on I think, real big questions. The other kind of main party in politics, the Teals, I have more to say about them, and we talk about climate policy specifically, but, for all the bluster and all the focus and the attention they get in election campaigns, post-election, it's very unclear what they are up to as well. And I think what that's led to is a situation where the Labor Party, without any obvious kind of political combatants or detractors, is being able to kind of skate through in these few months after Parliament without a lot of criticism. And even though the media likes to call itself the fourth estate, and it's like, look, the media hold governments to account. We don't just report on what everyone says. I think that's less true than ever. I think most of media reporting on federal politics is based on what the coalition says about Labor, or what the Teals say about the coalition, or what the Greens and Labor say about each other. So if all of that's absent, then you don't really have reporters pushing for what is going on with the government now. And this is standing out to me because whether it's climate policy, whether it's education policy, whether it's defense policy, whether it's culture policy, there's so much happening. So many bad things are happening, and there is not a policy debate that is reflective of that happening in the newspapers. And that's kind of my theory as to why. You don't have the opposition doing research into Labor policy. You don't have them or the Greens pushing forward an agenda and starting arguments. And of course, because there's no parliament, you don't have parliamentary debates either, which are such fodder for political journalists. What do you think about Oz's theory on the absence of debate in federal politics?
Yeah, I think there's something to it. I think I'd add to that I think part of it is probably everyone but the Labor Party, huge turnover in staff. It's people are, those parties, as you say, are licking their wounds, and they haven't decided yet, what their avenues of attack are, what they do want to go to the government over, what they don't. There's a lot of new people staffing who are figuring out what they want to stake their claim on. One thing that I definitely think falls into this category, you mentioned climate. And now I have to say that the media did actually report this quite loudly. I just think there were way more interesting stories happening in the world, so no one really cared. And also, I do think that, to your point, it lacked the teeth around it and the criticism and bite. And that's this Northwest gas shelf announcement, which people may have seen. It's a huge deal politically, I think, because it's sort of weird that it's two-term Labor government, and the first two things that happened was that weird factional bloodletting and extending a gigantic gas development is sort of a weird Labor's back, baby, second term, gas and factions. Practically why it's a big deal is the extension of this Northwest gas shelf site would produce 4.3 billion tons of emissions, the gas out of this thing. And it extends the life of the gas field out to 2070, which means that the whole Australian gas industry is going that long. We're committed to fossil fuels for the next 50 years. We're not transitioning before that now. So it's a big deal. Now, places like The Guardian and the Saturday paper have covered this fairly robustly, citing kind of progressive think tanks and environmental groups. But I don't think it has really come under as much scrutiny as you would expect for a government that was first elected a few years ago in, I think we all remember, something that was kind of universally dubbed a climate election. That's how Albanese came to power. And when you win a climate election, it feels weird that you are extending the Australian gas industry to 2070. And I think that the coverage has lacked kind of scrutiny of Albanese himself and what mandate the government has to do this, because, as you say, no one is making that political point. So the media can really only go to the kind of eggheads and the data people about why this is bad. Now, I was scrolling Instagram and I found something very interesting on this, which is Climate 200 founder Simon Holmes a Court a little while ago posted this notes app, almost apology style screenshot on the Climate 200 Instagram, where he said, after the announcement of this, I'm gutted. And he went on to lay into the Albanese government. He left this kind of hanging threat that, quote, there is no such thing as a safe seat, which kind of suggests Climate 200 could go after Labor seats over this. But I was like, does he realize if he's so mad about this, all the independents that he backed had one chance to push the government on emissions policy? It happened in the first year. And instead of push them for a real emissions policy, they waved through this thing called the safeguard mechanism. It's almost too boring to get into, but it basically doesn't mean that there's any hard limits on the government approving stuff like this. There's no hard limit. There's no real emissions policy. Once they voted for that, that's it. It's done. Yeah. There's not another piece of legislation the government is going to voluntarily bring forward that is a real emissions scheme. That was the debate. It was over. You had it. You waved it through. So I'm sort of confused why Simon Holmes Accord is so mad. And I think why the media hasn't latched on to what a big deal politically this is for Labor is a lot of those Climate 200 backed independents, they know that they voted for this. So the only one that's really saying a lot is Pocock. He's been quite strong, but everyone else kind of been very muted, sort of saying a lot of things like, we want to get back to Parliament so we can debate this. And we want to talk about the Northwest Gas Shelf. It's like, too late, guys. Too late. And it's not very strong criticism.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's interesting that Pocock has, exited the Climate 200 sort of ecosystem. He says he's going to do stuff on his own. I think the problems, you're totally right. Like the 2022 federal election, Labor was like, we're going to implement the safeguard mechanism and thereby end the climate wars. The piss weak mainstream environment groups were like, great, anything is better than Scott Morrison. Anything is better than Scott Morrison. That's fine. He gets in. The Teals and the Greens here have an opportunity to pick a fight on climate. They're spooked. They roll over. And that has defined, the next 3 years of climate policy in Australia. Labor looks at climate policy through the lens of how do we diffuse this as an issue, not through the lens of how do we stop runaway climate change and transition away from fossil fuels. And they've managed to do it. And they've managed to do it with the help of the Teals voting for their garbage policy and the help of the Greens voting for their garbage policy. Climate was not an issue at the last federal election, and the climate groups didn't really want it to be one. This is why I get so frustrated when people keep saying, we've got to stop Scott Morrison, so we've got to stop Peter Dutton. Whatever we do to stop them, it's great. It's like, okay, but we can stop them and what? Because if you don't have an and what, then you're going to end up with Labor and Power approving giant gas mines because no one pushed them to be better. If Labor went to an election promising to open this gas mine and they won a thumping majority, they're obviously going to open the gas mine. They're not going to not do it when they get into government. I think you're right. I think this one is a example of how the lack of a political contest is influencing the media's willingness to really go in and cover climate issues. Because where is the political fight on climate? I mean, even on this gas shelf, when the Teals and the Greens were saying stuff, it was very technocratic. It was very like, the Teals, interestingly, most of them weren't saying this is bad. They were saying we need a legislative trigger to stop stuff like this happening. It's more about how do we play these political games in Parliament than the big picture question of climate. And we should dedicate a whole episode, I think, to the challenges around climate policy and climate reporting. But I think you nailed that as an example of where kind of there's an absence of debate here.
Where else do you think this is happening?
One for me, and this is slightly different because, this is one where there is, from the Teals and the Greens at least, quite heavy criticism. But to me, it still sort of stands out as an area where Labor is doing something quite terrible and being allowed to get away with it. This is on higher education, right? University sector is in total disarray right now. There are thousands of job cuts that have been taking place over the last couple of years at public universities all around the country. Scott Morrison changed the way that university funding works, so it costs $50,000 now to get an arts degree, right? There is new research out this week from Andrew Norton, an independent kind of university researcher, that shows that students from lower income backgrounds are now not entering university, clearly because they're concerned about the cost benefit of it. Jenna Price, an academic and a columnist for the 9 Papers, wrote a piece saying, if you're not sure about going to uni, don't go. Like, there is so much chaos at universities. There are so few courses. There are so many job cuts. The cost is so high. It is not worth your time. This is extraordinary. Like, the university sector has been a kind of like pro-labor sector for so long. People who go to uni vote Labour. People who work at unis vote Labour. It's part of Labour's legacy, building up these public institutions. And they've watched Scott Morrison implement these horrible policies. They've now won 2 elections and have done nothing on this front. It's kind of fascinating to me that they're able to get away with this.
Yeah, and I think the media and sort of the public could be forgiven for thinking that Labour have. Like, there was the HEX debt kind of freeze of indexation. They passed accords with the universities, but like, there are huge black holes in the funding model that still have not been filled with any policy. Like, we're reducing international students, which fund domestic places and all this stuff. And Labour decided to do that for whatever, community anxiety or something. But then how do you replace that money? Because that money funds domestic places and research and all of these jobs. And there's no policy to fill it. So like, yeah, there are areas here where, yeah, as you say, I can sort of forgive the initial thought of not thinking this is an issue, but when you scratch the surface, there are big gaps here.
Yeah, I mean, like, there are so many other issues, right? And I don't even really know if this is like a media framing thing that this podcast is supposed to be about, or just a general frustration I've got. It's like, look, the childcare sector, going to the doctor, going to a psychiatrist, going to a hospital, all these things are more expensive and harder to access than they've ever been. Housing, right? Like, we keep having these housing elections. Rent keeps going up. You know, getting into the housing market is a bigger challenge than ever. Wage growth, like, it's just like, and this is partly media and it's partly just society. It's like, we are facing significant challenges as a country, younger people particularly, but everyone is. And it just doesn't feel like anyone in politics, very few people in media are sitting down and saying, okay, we are grappling with fundamental changes to how society works. And we are seeing what happens elsewhere when you don't grapple with these things. Like, look at the US, look at the UK, look at most of Europe. Like, the extreme polarization, the rise of the far right, in response largely to people feeling very disenfranchised and economically fucked, is real. It is coming for Australia. We can't fix it in a 10-minute segment on this podcast, but I guess it's just really stark to me how little serious engagement there is with giant questions right now. I mean, the one area where there is a bit of coverage about what Albanese is up to is on defense and AUKUS. Like, that seems to be where everyone is writing about federal politics.
He's in China this week. It's big. Who doesn't love him walking on the Bund with Kevin Muscat?
Has he met pandas yet? Has that happened?
I mean, Kevin Muscat isn't a panda. He's the former hard man captain coach of Melbourne Victory. Yeah, I mean, he's kind of a panda, I guess. Yeah, the bizarre thing on AUKUS to me, Oz, is that, you know, Trump administration has now put this under review and like may demand different terms from Australia or rip it up entirely. And the media coverage of this is slightly bizarre, both in America and here, I think, because to me, AUKUS is like the most Trumpian defense agreement ever. Like, it might as well have been drafted by Trump. Like, what does he want? He wants his allies to spend more money on defense. Check. This is literally the most money an Australian government has ever spent on anything, ever. Like, and then like all this money goes to America. Check. That's Trump. America first. We get all the money. And then also like the whole AUKUS submarine program creates American jobs in swing states the Republicans need to win. Check. Perfect. Trump, like, pork barreling. Great. And it seems like to me, the only reason Trump is doing this and he doesn't love it is because Biden did the deal. So he hates it and wants it to be better. Now, what's insane about that to me is the scrutiny on Albanese from kind of the media and from critics seems to be like, oh, can he smooth it over with Trump? Can he keep the American alliance alive? You're like, this deal already puts Australia so over the barrel and is so swung in favor of us just funneling money into the American economy. The idea of like, could we do more though to smooth it over is a crazy line of inquiry.
Yeah, I think this is an example where the media conversation is really pertinent to how the politics is playing out, right? Because the vast majority of the media and the defense establishment and defense reporters and kind of politics stuff is like, AUKUS is important. We need to align with the US and with the UK to stop China. We need to spend hundreds of billions of dollars reindustrializing US shipyards to do so, right? And so it was quite funny to me that when Trump announced he was renegotiating this deal, and kind of the leaks that we have out of that is that they want more money from the government. The response from journalists in Australia was give him whatever he needs, rather than like standing up for Australian sovereignty or kind of buttressing Albanese. I think if there was some space created that was like, actually, this is a good opportunity for us to revisit again a Scott Morrison negotiated deal and say this is absurd for the $380 billion, which is going to end up being $600 billion. We know this is what's going to happen. We could give everyone free childcare, free healthcare, free disability care, free university education, build high-speed rail. We could nationalize fucking Coles and Woolworths. Like, we could do everything with this money and instead we're giving it to America. But that space isn't allowed to exist in the media. And so Albanese, who, and you made this point to me, you talked about his John Curtin speech where he was sort of floating a balloon, right, for a slightly more independent foreign policy, was basically just like heavily criticized. So Labor on this one at least seems to be trying to find some cracks here, and they're getting shut down by the media.
The media hyperventilated and went nuts over the idea that Albanese would just say, oh, the great thing about this prime minister from 70 years ago was that he charted an independent course for Australia. Like that, he's just talking about a historic event of this minor thing, and it's like, oh my God, does this throw the whole American alliance? And I mean, just to end the point, I guess, it's like, I don't know, like, what more would the media like the Albanese government to spend like $1 trillion on it? Is like 650 billion not enough? Like, let's make it $1 trillion. And let's, rather than just saying we defend Taiwan, let's preemptively invade it. Let's get over that. It's like, how much more can we give to this thing? It's crazy.
It is totally crazy. Totally good to get that off our chests. You know, I just needed to offload about what the fuck is going on in politics right now. Thank you, Scott. All right, after the break, a little trip to Tasmania and then the latest on the ABC's programming slate. Okay, Scott, Tasmanian politics might not excite that many people. I have the sense that you're probably not as gripped by this and the vagaries of the Hare-Clark electoral system and Robson rotation as much as I am.
I have no idea what those words mean, but I am interested in just like Tasmania as a place. I feel like some amazing stories come out of there, both of the like terrible variety of terrible things happening to vulnerable people, and also like incredible like people and feats of things. I'm interested in the island. I'm not very interested in the parliament of it.
Well, one thing you are interested in is sports, and when sports and politics mix. And let me tell you, that is happening big time in Tasmania, right? So the election is happening this weekend. The context for this is quite fascinating. So Liberals have been governing in a hung parliament since 2024. In June, Labor moved a no confidence motion against the government that was supported by the Greens and the Independents. So the government's collapsed. There is a snap election. And the interesting thing here, Scott, is one of the key issues in the lead up to that no confidence motion, and in fact, one of the key issues of the campaign has been the construction of a new stadium in Hobart. And that is linked to Tasmania receiving an AFL team, right? Tasmania wants the Tassie Devils. They've wanted them for a long time. And the AFL has agreed to grant them a team if they build a stadium that could cost up to $1 billion. Right? So this is a big issue. And in fact, this was also the reason why there was an election in 2024. The deal between the government and the AFL to build the stadium led to two Liberals quitting the party and triggering elections. So this is the second election in a row that the Tasmanians will be voting on stadium-related kind of AFL drama, which to me is pretty fascinating. The kind of media angle of this is really interesting because whilst both parties, Labor and the Liberal Party, are publicly saying they support the stadium, if you read the media coverage of this issue, it is very clearly designed to make you think, a regular person, that the Liberals support the AFL and the stadium and Labor doesn't. It's very, very interesting. The ABC sports reporter in Hobart has written 8 pieces in the last month about the stadium issue in Tasmania. And I just kind of, I wonder whether there are other countries and other states, like there must be, where sports and politics interlink in this kind of a way. Like we have this in New South Wales, we have this in WA, we have this in Victoria, whether it's the NRL or the Formula One. Like it's kind of extraordinary that governments are so scared of what these big sporting institutions do that they're willing to throw $1 billion, which is a lot of money for a state like Tasmania, to keep the AFL on board. It's fascinating that 2 elections in a row have been triggered by drama around the stadium. There's no reason why Tasmania needs a stadium. They could just give them an AFL team, but there is a giant political battle underway right now that it was triggered by the introduction of a new Tasmanian AFL team, which I think is pretty fascinating.
It's super fascinating. And you know, Tasmania is one of the poorest states in Australia. So like it's a real issue when like, you know, the biggest spending going on in that state is for a stadium rather than, you know, it has the lowest, you know, high school graduation rates and all kinds of things. But I guess my little thing is, are you saying that Gillan McLachlan, former head of the AFL, didn't just murder the game? He's murdered 2 incumbent Tasmanian governments. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the murderer is back. That's exactly what I'm saying.
I know you say that this must happen elsewhere. Like there must be other countries, other states where this happens. I mean, to my knowledge, wherever the great game of rugby league has expanded has only brought stability, political stability, and prosperity. Peter V'landys.
I like what you're saying. You're saying that the NRL should have a team in Tasmania.
Yeah.
And then we can save. They don't need a new stadium for that. Save $1 billion. Expand NRL down south. Tasmanians are happy. The NRL is happy. Everyone's happy.
Give Peter V'landys sort of extrajudicial powers, like make him the Ian Bremmer of Tasmania, and he'll bring stability.
Well, they wanted NRL Island, right, during COVID. Just make Tasmania NRL Island. You know, what do you think about that?
I'm sorry to our regular listeners for my little departure into Roy and HG style broadcasting there.
It's a dream come true for both of us to just end up yelling about sports and policy. But yeah, keep a close eye on the Tasmanian election if you're a freak like me. Ben Rowie at the Tally Room will be live blogging it. He's great election analyst. I messaged Casey Briggs at the ABC to see if they were doing live coverage. He didn't respond in time to this show. So I'm sorry, Casey, if you are doing your hard work, check the TV guide. Scott, you've got one for us as well in our Keeping Tabs segment.
Yeah, look, this is really off the back of something you've been talking about a lot, which is kind of the true crime explosion. And last week, a press release went out from the ABC that there will be a new comedy panel show hosted by Julia Zemiro. I love Julia Zemiro. A comedy panel show about true crime.
No way.
And I was reading the quotes in this. Was fascinating. This is from the company that's producing it in partnership with the ABC, Dream Chaser, which just so happens to be a company that used to include Hugh Marks, the managing director of the ABC, actually was a founder of this company. But the quote from the executive producers at this production company say, quote, "We're thrilled to be launching this brand new comedy true crime panel show in partnership with the ABC, working alongside a brilliant panel of criminologists and comedians to find the fascinating real-life cases we're all obsessed with in the funniest possible way." The funniest possible way.
I gotta say,
murders?
We talked about true crime stuff whenever it was last week, and you were like, "Oh, you know, I fear that this could be where the ABC goes." I was like, "I think this is where they go, man. I think this is where this starts and this is where it goes." And this happened. We saw this like 2 hours after we recorded. I was like, "We almost need to re-record because this just was too perfect in terms of the issues that we were identifying."
Yeah, I was saying that my jury's out. The jury is slowly coming down to the courtroom. My jury is slowly coming down. The thing that drives me bonkers about this, I mean, setting aside the like funniest possible way to talk about murders, is the ABC cannot make any other type of show than just making the Gruen transfer again and again and again. This is just the Gruen of true crime. It's experts and comedians break it down. And I was...
A bit of insight, a bit of laughs.
Yeah, bit of insight, bit of laughs. And I'm just like, can the ABC make another kind of show? Has it forgotten how to make any other show but this show? And just to show you how I'm not just going insane, this is real. Gruen Transfer itself already has 3 spin-off versions. There was Gruen Planet, Gruen Nation, which was about politics, and they briefly did Gruen Sweat, which was about the Olympics for some reason. Now, if you go through the list of different shows that are basically the Gruen of something else, they get increasingly deranged as time goes on. So it started in 2017 with the Gruen of television and film, Screen Time. Reasonable kind of extension of that idea. Then there was the Gruen of the Future, which was Tomorrow Tonight, hosted by Annabelle Crabb. There was sort of the Gruen of like national opinion polling, the special Australia Talks. And
all right, hang on. I was involved in that. That was a great show. How dare you? Yeah.
I was in the development meetings. It was weird. It was a weird time. I'll tell the story one day of the development meetings for that show. There was, by 2021, I think they were like, oh, none of these are working. If we're going to do the Gruen of something, we might as well just like get the same guy who does Gruen. So then they did the Gruen of Misinformation and News, Question Everything, hosted by Will Anderson. And then in 2024, last year, they did the Gruen of Sports, Monday's Experts. These are so many versions of the same show. And I know they like give jobs to talented writers. I know a bunch of people who make these shows. And they can be good for like giving people a platform in media. Who doesn't want to see like some new faces go on some of these panels? But the idea, it just feels like such cultural death that the only idea that the ABC commissioned is this show that worked like Gruen debuted, over 15 years ago, and they're still trying to make this of everything to now the point they're getting comedians and experts to break down actual murders of real people. And the only reason this keeps happening, I think, is that these things get commissioned because no one can get fired over commissioning them. If you at the ABC go, there's this topic and this audience segment that we want to reach, let's Gruen that, you won't get in trouble, despite the fact that a bunch of these shows have like dragged down their time slots. Some of them only lasted 1 season or 2 seasons, got axed, but no one will ever get in trouble for commissioning a Gruen clone.
Because it's not a risk, even if it doesn't work. It's not, you tried the Gruen of that, it didn't work, Yeah, I totally agree with you, Scott. And I mean, one thing that stood out to me, to take it back to the true crime component of this, is Rachel Miller, the head of ABC Entertainment, in her quote, when the Julia Zemiro show was announced, she said, "For anyone who loves binging the latest true crime podcast or playing detective in the group chat, this is the show for you." It's like you couldn't identify more what is wrong with the current moment of true crime consumption. The playing detective in the group chat is like is where this stuff has gone out of control, where people are taking information that isn't all the information available and thinking that they know what's going on. The kind of social ramifications of this true crime moment are summed up there in one sentence. The fact that ABC doesn't see that as a problem, but instead sees that as a commissioning opportunity, I think is pretty gross. It's not good. And it's just like you said, it's risk adverse. It's a missed opportunity. We've both said this before. Will Anderson got the Glass House when he was 26. Very happy for him to continue running Gruen. Crazy that the ABC won't take any real risks on new and exciting shows and formats.
And just finally, the thing that actually made Gruen good and a hit was like, they had people like Russell and stuff on there who like exposed the bad things about that industry. They were quite honest about the bad things in the advertising industry. None of these follow-ups do that. I have zero faith, even though there will be talented people involved. I love Julia Zemiro. I actually could use some more Julia Zemiro on my TV. But none of these have, and I have no faith this will, actually have people from these industries revealing things, interrogating what's wrong with their own industry.
Yeah, it would be great to have an ex-cop be like, we didn't bother investigating this crime because it was an Indigenous person. We just don't care about them. Like, if the show does that,
yeah, exactly.
I take back my criticism.
Or like, we feed the media this kind of stuff because we want them on our side, or like any of that. It won't happen.
Yeah, it won't happen. It won't happen. You know what will happen, Scott? Another episode of the show next week. And that is how I'm wrapping up this week's episode.
I love it. Thank you to our producer, Bez. and people should subscribe to the newsletter, Oz.
They should. lamestream.com.au. Subscribe to the newsletter. Hit us up with questions at contact@lamestream.com.au. Like, subscribe, share the Instagram reels, review the podcast, do all the stuff you got to do to get this in front of other people. Thank you for listening. Scott, see you next week.
See you next week, Oz.